Hello, everyone. It's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive. Welcome to my live stream where we're talking about the dramatic events, political events in Nepal and in France. Government collapse in both countries, but is one a regime change instigated by foreign actors, or are both driven by primarily domestic issues and problems in their political systems? That's what I'm talking about today. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion as we're all trying to make sense of these events on the fly. And when we do, it's very easy to fall into habits of thinking, theories that have worked well for past events but may not work so well for this particular thing. And Sia Berlin, the great political thinker, political philosopher, once wrote that one of the benefits of studying history is that it can help you develop political judgment, and that the essence of political judgment is not just applying a theory across, a fixed theory across all sorts of different situations, but actually working out what is the particular issue going on in this particular circumstance with these particular individuals, and trying to work your way through how to solve a particular problem with it. Thanks everyone for joining me. Do please join me at jeffrich.substack.com, and let's get into this whole discussion of when is a political protest genuine and when is it a foreign-inspired regime change destabilization operation. We see this issue at play at the moment in the events in Nepal and the events in France. The very dramatic events in Nepal and the very dramatic events in France. In the thumbnail for the live stream, I included a photo of the Nepalese parliament, a former palace built, I think, in about 1912. A very large palace in Asian terms, burning, having been, raided and then set alight by protesters overnight. And there have been some tragic deaths from these kind of fires as well, tragic injuries, as well as deaths of protesters being shot by police. And in France today is the 10th of September. In the last couple of days, the French Prime Minister has lost a no confidence vote in Paris, in the National Assembly. President Emmanuel Macron has been forced to appoint a new Prime Minister, whose name I will get to in a minute, just in the last few hours. And today is a designated day of protest by a movement called Bloquons Tout. Let us block everything. Which is a kind of, damn them all kind of protest, sort of almost a kind of an economic withdrawal protest as well that's going on there in France. It's too early to know just how significant this protest will be, but there is a significant political crisis going on in France. I talked about it a little bit last night with Jamal Thomas on his show, and that's on the community tab if you haven't already noticed. And I'm going to look at both of these things. Now, in both of these cases, there are, as so often these days when there's political unrest and political protest, there are accusations of foreign actors, the influence of foreign actors. Many people have said that the event in Nepal is a classic color revolution, a classic American instigated regime change operation. there are occasionally indication or complaints that some of the political protests in France in recent years have been sponsored, on the other hand, by Russians or whoever, Elon Musk even as well. So no country, I guess, is safe from the accusation of regime change, although Emmanuel Macron is also often accused of being a globalist, protected by those same sort of intelligence agencies. And when events like Nepal, events like France happen, the world suddenly tunes into a complex local political context with very little information and just a few dramatic images, a few fragments of information, and a lot of well-established theories about how the world works, and produces a highly selective, quick take on what is happening. And, speaking as someone who comments on these kind of world events on YouTube, this is, always a temptation to quickly identify what you think, the hot take is on a current situation without really sort of digging into the specific local circumstances, without sort of saying, this theory worked last time, but does it really apply in this case? And some commentators, I think, particularly on the Nepal situation, but also in ways on the France situation, have, fallen into this trap a little bit, I think. They've have some strong theories that really cut through and appear to give a clear-cut explanation of events. But it is, on closer examination, something of a prefabricated solution. Let me just give you an example then of what I have in mind here. And I'll just share with you a little snippet from the Duran earlier this morning, where they had Brian Beletic, a very well-known and well-established commentator who has many excellent analyses of military situations and strategic situations, and I guess, the information psychological operations that, the American government in particular is well known for, the sort of democracy promotion, regime change operations that the American government is well known for. But he was, interviewed on the Duran last night, and he spoke about the Nepal situation after talking about Venezuela and I think Indonesia as well. Now, I'll just play this for you. Hopefully it will all work well. And it's only about 45 seconds. So I will just cue it up here and we'll just hear what Brian has to say about Nepal. Not to pick on Brian, I must emphasise, but rather just to illustrate this sort of issue that, everyone like me who comments instantaneously on events can sometimes fall victim to.
Headed by Thaksin Shinawatra has kind of been sidelined, but this is going to be a continuous issue. Here. This will be a continuous threat hanging over Thailand. And
I'll just correct the play speed there for you, just sort of speeding it up for myself.
And the region. And, Nepal, the last one, I didn't have enough time to really research it deeply, but I was looking at CPJ, the Committee for Protection of Journalists, which is, again, just another fake front. It protects U.S.-funded propagandists. That's what it actually does. They were talking about a social media ban in Nepal. Nepal said, if you want to operate a social media platform in Nepal, you have to register with the government and you have to follow our local laws, or you cannot operate here. This is what China told Facebook and Google. And so then they said, all right, well, we're not doing that, and we're going to burn your country down. So that's what they ended up doing. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
And it is perhaps a good thing that he is leaving it there, I think, because it wasn't really perhaps the greatest of comments there from Brian, not terribly well informed. And indeed, you get similar kind of comments. Let's have a look at this one, for example, from S.L. Kanthan, who is an Indian-based commentator, who says 100% US engineered color revolution in Nepal, standard playbook seen dozens of times around the world, young brainwashed people burning down the parliament and residences of top politicians, leader likely fleeing the country, etc. Now watch an American puppet sworn in as the new leader, just like in Bangladesh and Pakistan. And there you can actually see the smoke plumes above the Nepalese parliament and protesters outside. But there's a real weakness to these kind of comments, I think. You get similar kind of things, I guess, also with the French commentary as well. Let's just have a quick look at some of these things, these sort of quick, rough sort of solutions that people have about it. I just Googled globalist Macron on X to give you a bit of a sample of what kind of things people are saying. We've got comments about his role in Africa, of course, and then you have this comment by protester Liz Churchill: the World Economic Forum globalists are losing. Let's go, France. France belongs to the French. Out with Macron. And frankly, I find a quite disturbing video there of some black masked protesters having a kind of pretty demonic looking torchlight demonstration. And then you also find that on the same day that a largely leftist or anarcho-leftist, anarcho-capitalist even, Bloquons Tout demonstration is announced. The French nationalists, Marine Le Pen, has announced the nationwide strike on September 10 on the same theme, claiming that the divide is no longer between the left and the right, but between patriots. And of course, our good friend Alexander Dugin has stepped in, saying, finally, far-left Mélenchon and far-right Marine Le Pen could overcome their differences and strike liberal globalist Sorosite Macron. And this is the scenario to follow everywhere. So they are some examples of the kind of thing that we have in mind, that I have in mind. But as I say, I think this is really adopting a fixed theory that everything is manipulated by the CIA, that it's all part of the ongoing agenda of the CIA or the globalists, your designated, elite, your dominant power group, and that they're simply manipulating events, and some protests are designated as genuine, the protests of patriots, some are designated as those of brainwashed people. It's always been this way, often, that protests are misunderstood and misinterpreted, not in terms of the actual intentions and agency and real motivations of these people, or the way in which they really sort of interact with politics, but rather a limited sort of view that is really more about favouring one sort of outcome or other. Let me give you another example here, and this is from the global left thinker Vijay Prashad, who, certainly does not support American regime change operations. And he wrote a very thoughtful post on X saying, we really need a better theory of concepts such as regime change and colour revolution. They are used far too loosely and do not register the contradictions in our societies. Certainly, the forces of imperialism make any and every attempt to take advantage of our weaknesses, but that does not mean that every social upsurge is engineered by outsiders. Let me just emphasize that a little bit more. He says, where are we? That does not mean that every social upsurge is engineered by outsiders. If you hold to such a position, then you rigidly oppose every single popular uprising, since you can never be sure if it is just made up of marionettes with their strings pulled elsewhere. Always study the contradictions carefully and learn about the social dynamics involved, rather than apply concepts mechanically that dissolve the actual experiences and consciousness of the classes that act in history. Now, he writes from a kind of Marxist perspective, which is totally fine, but I think he is making a very good point here that let's dig in now into some of the other cases that we're sort of looking at, and try to do exactly what Vijay Prashad has suggested, not just apply a theory. It's all a CIA regime change, democracy promotion operation, colour revolution operation. It's the same continuous agenda. Or it's all part of a globalist conspiracy that's resisting the forces of, patriotic nationalism around the world to enforce the interests of bankers or whoever you might believe is behind all the events of the world. What's really going on in France? What's really going on in Nepal? And what does it sort of tell us about broader theories? And one of the things I actually discovered, which I'll get to towards the end of this stream, is in looking at trying to understand what is going on in France, I discovered last night that the very prominent and influential French historian, economist Thomas Piketty, the author of the book Capital from a few years ago, that was a surprise bestseller around the world because it's a pretty dense, heavy read. His book Capital, which really identified, growth of wealth inequality around the world and how that was distorting, if you like, democratic politics. He is just about to publish a new book, which is called A History of Political Conflict, Elections and Social Inequalities in France, 1789 to 2022. Obviously, he's not going to take it up to 2025. But it's actually an incredibly timely diagnosis of what's going on in France and how the underlying social dynamics of what's going on in France can be applied to other societies around the world. One that is really based on careful analysis of what's really going on, rather than just implying that it's all the result of the interventions of malicious foreign actors. Okay, let's first talk about Nepal. And, this is a complex situation, which I by no means am a deep expert on. I'll come back to some of the commentary from people in the comments a little bit later in the show. But please throw in your comments. Really interested in your discussion, and I'll come back to it a little bit later in the show. Let's have a look first at Nepal and dramatic events. Overnight, the Prime Minister Oli, I believe, has resigned. and, quite tragic events as well. And I haven't checked the news for the last couple of hours, but the situation is developing and continuing to develop. I believe Indian soldiers have gone to reinforce the border between India and Nepal. It is a quite complicated and tense situation right now. It, however, didn't just happen yesterday. It didn't just happen because of a social media ban, as BJ Prashad, whatever his sort of ideological biases, his sort of framework of analysis based around Marxist analysis is saying. And I should say the Nepalese government, some people have said, has been quite close to China. So to some degree, Vijay Prashad's comments here are interesting. There is a deeper history as well. Nepal was a monarchy for quite a long time, 150 years, I believe. And in the early 2000s, that monarchy was sort of overthrown, leading to a pretty conflict, a decade of civil war and a difficult transitional period. And up to 2021, and if there are any Nepalese experts who've overcome the YouTube ban and others in the region who have more detail, please do share it with in the comments, and I'll love to get back to it a little bit later, because as I say, I'm not presenting this as a deep expert, but as just someone who's trying to make sense of events. So up to 2021, there was frequent government changes in Nepal with 10 different governments, and a kind of some people talk about a sort of power sharing arrangement. In 2021, there was a political crisis with the current Prime Minister KP Oli losing a confidence vote, a dissolved parliament and fresh elections, and then the Supreme Court intervened. So there's conflicts between the judiciary, the executive, and the parliament, and a sort of a power sharing sort of arrangement. All of this is occurring in the context, of course, of COVID from 2020 to, I guess, 2022. And, some real difficulties in Nepalese society, which I'll come back to in a second. Then leading up to this most recent event, there's been growing criticism of corruption and the wealth of the ruling elite, many of whom are formerly associated with Communist Party, Maoist Party, and so forth. Nepal is not a wealthy society, and a very large proportion of Nepalese people live and work overseas and send their money back to Nepal. The sort of remittance economy, which is quite significant. And this is relevant for understanding the social media ban, because, there's not a lot of opportunities for young people in Nepal. And so when the government did ban several social media platforms, including Facebook, YouTube, I think it was about 16 to 20 social media platforms, for failing to comply with rules set by the authorities, it really provoked significant protests. And then when government soldiers shot a number of those security forces, responded with violence to those protests, leading to, I think, 19 to 20 deaths. The protests only escalated, and that is, I guess, the result of the last few days. Now, I guess the regime change operation type hypothesis, the somewhat dismissive comments from someone like Brian Beletic there saying, they're just burning the place down, again, tries not at all to try to understand what is in the minds and the interests and the thoughts of the Nepalese. Now, I should add that Vijay Prashad has that I'm not just going to rely on my own viewpoint here. There are a number of other sources I've consulted over the last 8 hours or so while researching this that indicate some of these deeper sort of issues. So let's just have a look at this one. Here's a comment from Vijay Prashad on his YouTube saying, excellent article from Atul Chandra and Pramesh Pokhara of the Communist Party of Nepal, one of the parties that has actually been affected by these events. Part of the sort of ruling power sharing type elites. And again, he refers to this in the context of a better explanation than that offered by people like Brian Beletic or S.L. Kanthan. And the actual article that Vijay Prashad is referring to is this one here. Nepal's Gen Z uprising is about jobs, dignity, and a broken development model. It's at peoplesdispatch.org if you want to check it out for yourself. Let me just read you a very brief part of it. Let me just do it like this, if that's okay. So the resignation of Nepali Prime Minister K.P. Oli amid massive youth-driven protests has raised many questions for the people of Nepal and its once united left. While many have accused the uprising about merely being in response to a social media ban, the roots are much deeper. Kathmandu is not on edge. Where are we? Is not on edge. Here we go. Is not on edge because of apps, but because a generation raised on the promise of democracy and mobility has collided with an economy and political order that keep shutting every door. And again, it is very interesting here. Again, he refers in this article to the issues about remittances and migration. If one metric explains the generational mood, it is exit labour permits. 839,266 exit labour permits issued in the last financial year, translate into thousands leaving every day. At peak, these are not tourists, they are the very cohort now on the street. Their remittances, 33% of GDP, keep households afloat and the import bill paid. So there we go. And then also to just illustrate that this is not only Vijay Prashad and his friends, let me share another article here which comes from RT, which you can see here. So this is some interviews with a group of Russian experts on Nepal's Generation Z uprising. That appears to be the new term for it. Colour revolutions are turning into internet revolutions. But this is quite an interesting piece which talks to half a dozen experts, Boris Volkonsky, Elza Shugazina, Ilya Spektor, Nikolai Starikov, who tends to favour a regime change operation explanation. But I think the most interesting piece is by this person, Alexei Makarkin, which talks about some of the demographics and then talks about some of the fundamental dynamics. Here you can see, he says, politically, Nepal has been dominated by three major forces since the abolition of the monarchy in 2008, the Nepali Congress, Congress, the Maoist Communists and the Marxist-Leninist Communists. They have formed shifting coalitions over the years. Most recently, the Congress and Marxist-Leninists governed together while the Maoists sat in opposition. But to the Zoomers, they all look the same, an entrenched elite guilty of inefficiency, backroom deals and corruption. The street violence that broke out on September 9 has been directed at politicians of all these parties. And this has been brewing for some time, he says. He refers to a popular TV anchor, Rabi Lamachani, who recorded nearly 11% of the vote in 2022 elections, and a royalist party, again remembering it was a monarchy for a long time, that got to 5.5% of the vote. But he also here, you can see, refers to the Kathmandu, the major city in Nepal's mayoral race, where the winner, Balen Shah, who was a rapper born in 1990, better known simply as Balen, who also holds a master's degree in civil engineering. He ran on bread and butter, urban issues, trash collection, traffic jams, illegal construction, and poor city planning, and used, I guess, social media strategies to start to highlight his changes. And here we say, this year, small royalist demonstrations pose little threat to the establishment. What really worried the ruling elite was the anger among young people. In that climate, the Prime Minister Sharma Oli's September 5 decision to ban major foreign social media platforms acted as a spark to the powder keg. Within days, protests had turned deadly. About 20 people were killed in early clashes, which quickly radicalized the movement. And he says, protesters began torching government buildings, attacking politicians they caught in the streets, and even burning court files reminiscent of Russia's February Revolution, when criminals joined the uprising. Indeed, reminiscent of many such events. Indeed, the shooting of protesters leading to this kind of thing is very much a common event. And he refers here to Bali throwing his support behind the Zoomers while the army refused to back the government. So, interesting issue, and it is by no means over yet. And, I think it again shows that there is a lot more to this issue than just CIA interference, an attempt by a pro-China government to control its information space and block Western media apps. There's more to the protests than just the, spoiled, brainwashed complaints of youthful protesters. I'd be interested in views anyone has in the comments as well. And why don't I just quickly turn to them there to see if there's interesting. I can see a range of different opinions on this as well, and I think some people are also commenting on the complexity of events, the different issues, the different motivations, and all the rest of it. So that's fantastic. Really interested. And Animal Farms asked me whether I've ever considered. I have actually indeed invited Brian onto the show, but that hasn't happened yet. He's a very busy guy, and it'd be good to discuss these issues with him. But again, I do feel, sometimes, if you've got a hammer, you always see a nail sometimes. And certainly one of my the things I learned in 30 years of government and many years studying history is you've really got to keep a kind of a flexible mind about events. Events always develop in ways that are not planned or not theorized. And it's really good to keep a flexible mind about interpreting events, especially when you know next to nothing about the local context in which they're occurring, the local motivations of the actual people protesting, what's really driving them. I mean, there's a long tradition in the study of revolutionary crowds, all the way back to the French Revolution in the 1789 plus, and the English Revolution, etc., and the Russian Revolution, and all the rest of it, about the complexity of crowd motivations, what appears to be mob violence, and can be caricatured as inspired by foreign actors, or inspired by irrationality. There's often a lot more complexity to it as well, and real agency has, people have shown again and again and again in historical studies how real agency is exercised in these situations. So I really think this sort of idea that, there's one organization in the world that controls everything that happens in the world, whether it's the CIA or the WEF or some, group that you dislike, is really not a good way of trying to explain these complex domestic political and international political events. Of course, it's not to deny that there is, these days, international involvement in almost every country's domestic political affairs, partly simply because of mass communications and migration and international economic linkages and cultural linkages as well. There has been a sort of a globalization, a tangling up of the world's politics. But that doesn't mean that, it's all controlled by the CIA or the National Endowment of Democracy or others. But it may well be that, Brian's got a point on many of the points that he has to make. But I do think certainly, and I think forgivably, I guess he was really put a little bit on the spot, I think, commenting on the fly on Nepal. I think he perhaps might have made a little bit of a mistake there. Let's turn now to France, and it's an interesting comparison because, people are very happy to say foreign interference in Nepal. People are perhaps less happy to say foreign interference in France, but there have been allegations of foreign interference in French politics as well. Remember J.D. Vance haranguing Europe earlier this year about the enemy within. Remember Elon Musk's explicit support for the AfD in the German elections. And remember, there have, even in Prime Minister Bayrou's defiant resignation speech, there were intimations that perhaps the US is interfering a little bit in how things are happening in France as well. There have been over time, wild accusations of Russian interference behind the Yellow Vest protests and similar kinds of things. And of course, as I was pointing out before, there are these kind of pretty what would you say, pretty conspiratorial arguments about the way in which a globalist elite is controlling the French government through the person of Emmanuel Macron. You can just see a few of them. Here we are. Here's an example from Wide Awake Media. The modern political asset doesn't need reprogramming. He only needs ambition, vanity, and the right people whispering promises of power and protection in his ear. And of course, Alex Christoforou, Vance crushes globalists, etc., etc. Some of this sort of commentary, I think, is not very well informed. So what exactly has happened in France? It's a complex scenario. Let me just give you a quick timeline, and it's perhaps worth going back all the way to 2017 when Emmanuel Macron was first elected as president of France, because his election was in a way a response to the breakdown of the political party system in France itself. The Socialist Party imploded, the right-wing party, I can't remember its name, Republican Party maybe, also imploded, partly due to corruption type scandals and also failures in government. And then Macron was elected a second time in 2022 with a reduced majority and a reduced parliamentary control. And after, some troubled years where, his initial hopes, perhaps, of European sovereignty and all that sort of thing came up against the challenges of COVID, and then the challenges, of course, of the Ukraine war. And in when was it? It was, I think, it was 2023, I think, that Emmanuel Macron also sought to introduce significant changes to pensions in aged pensions in France, partly to deal with the same economic and budget issues that are, behind the current current political crisis in France. But that provoked enormous protests, fires, that sort of thing, huge protests, burning restaurants. Nothing quite of the scale of what we've seen in Nepal in recent days. But someone did torch Emmanuel Macron's favourite restaurant, apparently. And, there were garbage bins set afire, that sort of thing. And all of this was occurring also in the context of significant social tensions driven in part by the nationalist issues of the Rassemblement National, the kind of people who were marching in those sort of black balaclavas that I showed earlier on. Just give me 1 second, folks. I'm just going to quickly have a sip of water here. And this led to basically, although Macron was ultimately able to implement his reforms, he did it through a kind of presidential decree. There was a lot of debate about whether it was legal. It went to France's constitutional court. It was agreed to be legal, and it was sort of implemented, but disliked by many people. And then in 2024, there was first the European Parliament elections, in which the Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National party, far-right party if you like, or nationalist patriotic party if you prefer, won a significant number of French European parliamentary votes. And this led to a snap election in France in 2024, leading in July 2024, not as some people expected, to a victory for the far right, but rather a kind of higher than expected performance by a new Popular Front, the Nouveau Front Populaire alliance that won more seats than any other bloc, but still did not have a majority. And this presented a very complex scenario, difficult scenario for Emmanuel Macron, because French politics was effectively divided into three blocs: the sort of socialist, green, radical left bloc, the centrist, liberal, progressive, globalist bloc, and the nationalist, patriotic, far right, anti-immigrant, if you like, bloc of the Nouveau Front Populaire. And none really wanted to work with each other. And Emmanuel Macron's was, if you like, the smallest of these parties. But as president, he had the power to choose the prime minister, and he chose ultimately a man called Michel Barnier of the Conservative Labour Republicans, very much a technocratic sort of politician. But his government collapsed, and then that ultimately led in December 2024 to Macron appointing his centrist ally Francois Bayrou to replace Barnier. And they went through a long, difficult process of passing a budget. The French budget has significant deficit issues and long-standing debt issues, which reflect social spending priorities in France, but were at the heart of the previous attempts to introduce pension reforms. But pension reforms perhaps haven't quite delivered as much as they were expecting. That are, in any case, a sort of set of changes that have long-term consequences. Anything to changes and, age pension type issues are not immediate savings. They're significant structural changes in a public sector budget that, yield benefits over 10 to 20 years. All of this leads to chronic division within the French National Assembly and standoff between the political parties, which broadly break into those three blocs, but each of those three blocs themselves are divided. The left is divided between the Socialist Party, which some see as not really socialist, more like, sort of Albanese's sort of Labour Party in Australia, and the more radical sort of left populist party of France Insoumise, who are also not prepared to collaborate with the socialists, and there are also communist parties and other such things, and there are similar splits within the centre and within the right. So it is absolute political. It's a very complicated situation in which there is not much of a culture of forming coalitions, and this has meant that nobody has really been able to agree to a plan to pass a budget to deal with the spending issues. And this has come to a head in the last couple of months, with Bayrou making a dramatic speech a little while ago saying, France really must deal with its problems. He was its budgetary problems, its deficit, and so forth. And he, brought himself, brought a vote of confidence on in the French National Assembly, which is the traditional way of expressing support or not support within a parliamentary system. Doesn't really operate this way within the US Congress for any American viewers, but it's the traditional way to have a vote of confidence to continue a government in operation. Bayrou really knew his budgetary reforms were not going to be passed. He brought on the vote of confidence. He sort of kind of willingly went to the executioner, if you like, in terms of his government's lifespan. And this This led to, on the 8th of September, Bayrou being ousted as Prime Minister after losing a vote of confidence at the National Assembly. And just yesterday, September 9, Emmanuel Macron has appointed Sébastien Lecornu to replace Bayrou as Prime Minister. Now, Sébastien Lecornu has been the defense minister, very supportive of Emmanuel Macron's pro-Ukraine foreign policy, let's say, and also his demands to increase defense expenditure. And already the various parties have said that they have said that they're not prepared to really collaborate with Sébastien Lecornu on a new budget, given his expressed priorities in the past. He's been given the challenge by Macron of creating a consensus around a new budget. We will see what happens. But at this point, it's not looking like the political crisis in France is going to be really resolved any time soon. And as I mentioned earlier on, today, September 10, 2025, it must be still quite early in the day, in the morning in France. So we'll see how these protest events develop. But there has been there is a day of protest called Bloquons Tout, which is a kind of like a boycott, almost like a boycott of participation in the current sort of society. Most of the analysis says most of the supporters of the Bloquons Tout, of the left, supportive of Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Insoumise party, the sort of rebel left party, and some of whom were also supportive of the Yellow Vest protests a couple of years ago. At this point, it's also a little bit murky exactly who is behind and who is organising this event. There's a particular sort of entrepreneur who is one of the key figures behind it. It appears to express anti-EU and almost anarcho-capitalist kind of sentiments at times. And whether, as perhaps Brian Bolletic suspected of the Nepalese protest, whether there is also foreign interest and foreign involvement, because that kind of anarcho-capitalist type sentiment, anti-EU sentiment, is certainly the kind of thing that's been expressed by many US oligarchs and politicians in recent times as well. Think Elon Musk, think Peter Thiel, and think many of the other ones. So we shall see. It's still too early to tell whether and how much impact the Block Everything protest will have. Still too early to tell how the broad political coalitions in France will really respond to the attempts by the new Prime Minister to form a budget. But it's not looking to me like there's going to be a whole lot of practical problem solving occurring anytime soon. Okay, so let me just check my notes as to what I need to talk about next. I wanted also to just, comment on what are a couple of the sort of underlying factors behind this whole issue. And let me also perhaps just talk about the budget situation as well. Now, let me add, just give me 1 second, if I can operate my Yes, this is the one. Okay, here we have a chart from the IMF of government expenditure as a percentage of GDP from 1800 indeed to 2023, I think it goes to. And the blue, if you go to the far right, the blue line, light blue line right at the top, that is France. And the green line, which is, if at the far right, is sort of in the middle, that is Britain. And the red line is the United States. And you can see that from about 1980, the French government expenditure as a percentage of GDP has, gradually tracked upwards with ups and downs pretty much, but in a broad slope upwards from 1980. A little bit more, but not aggressively more than that what is occurring in both Britain and the United States. Although it's fair, you can see the United States has sort of gone up a little bit, mainly in two big bursts. I think part one based around the financial crisis and one based around the COVID era. And Britain, a little bit similar, but a little bit more, on average declining, especially from the Thatcher years. The sort of, if you were to draw a line through the sort of 1980 point of Britain through to now, it would just gently slope downwards. But France has been sloping upwards. But if you can, you might note that if you follow the blue line back to 1980, there is a very extreme, steep discontinuity in the trend of government expenditure. In France, it's pretty flat post-war until about 1980, and then it jumps up suddenly around 1980. And then it sort of follows a similar track to, similar but more generous track to those two other countries. And that is basically the time when, of course, Francois Mitterrand's government came to power, and indeed when the pension age for France was reduced to the very low levels that it was reduced to in Francois Mitterrand's time in sort of 1980. So you can see the sort of structural basis for the French public spending problem, if it is a public spending problem, is very long term. And that in comparative terms, yes, they are spending a little bit more as a proportion of GDP, but it's not, it's not order of magnitude more. It's like maybe a 10% more as a percentage of GDP, 10%, 10% over, whatever it is, 4 or 5% of GDP. Oh, no, not 4 or 5%. I can't remember what the actual number was there. But, a significant difference, but not absolutely catastrophic difference. And similarly, I think this is the same issue with the debt. Yes, there is a high proportion of debt per GDP, but it is also serviceable. People can get over, particularly advocates of austerity can sometimes use alarming public debt numbers, but public debt is of a different nature to private debt, as I think the economist Adam Tooze and many others have explained. So there are significant fiscal issues, and those fiscal issues are a fundamental driving factor in this political crisis, because there is a significant problem. The pension age in France is significantly lower than it is in other countries. There are particular schemes with particular issues that you sort of need to sort of dig into the detail about that cause particular problems for French spending patterns and productivity patterns and so forth. But on the whole, but at the moment, the highly fractured nature of the political system in France is unable to deal with it. So I just wanted to really highlight that issue, because there is a real problem there that is underlying many of these issues in France, and I think part of the difficulty is that the political system is not really finding a way to sort of sort out these problems. Is it economic collapse issue? I don't really think so. I've seen many commentators. I mean, there are all the sort of, crypto friendly sort of the EU's about to collapse type commentators out there. But I think, as I understand it, the markets have not been particularly, it's not that huge of an issue really for the markets in France. That's probably more important than anything. And, France will continue on. Economies always have their issues. I don't think they're about to collapse anytime soon, but they do have a significant fiscal issue. I think the more serious issue is the chronic fragmentation and lack of effective workability of the political system there in France. There are about 12 parties in the National Assembly. The nature of the electoral system and the fragmentation of the party system after the collapse of the sort of traditional parties of the 20th century and the early 21st century. It's sort of been remade around new models, and people are still really finding a way to work together. And yet many of the key individuals are long-standing members of that 20th century political system, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, like François Bayrou as well. They're sort of old hacks in new clothes. And so it's a really complicated set of political issues, and it's further complicated by the divisions within parties, between blocs, and this sort of standoff between the three broad blocs now that are there within the political system of France: the progressive nationalists, the liberal centrists, progressivists, globalists, and the radical left, I guess, and green parties as well, and the socialists as well, who are more, I guess, a centre-left sort of group. So the political crisis is real, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be resolved anytime soon. And it's also not. It's a real, genuine problem of, you got to put 20 people together in a room, and they all have to agree on how to spend however many billion euros the French budget is, and whatever the tax take of the French budget is. And at the moment, no one in that looked up in that room can find a way to work together appropriately. But it also, this tripartite division, if you like, of French politics is also it also reflects a social crisis as well. The kind of things that you see in the black masked demonstrations, the kind of things you see in the frustration with the system expressed by the Block Everything protest, and the kind of thing that we saw previously in the Yellow Vest, and I guess the sort of anti-COVID protests as well. So real issues, and interestingly, there is even perhaps I guess a constitutional crisis, a regime crisis. To some degree, there was a constitutional crisis during the pension debate within France because, people did challenge Emmanuel Macron's presidential decree without parliamentary approval or National Assembly approval to, introduce his pension reforms. It was ultimately upheld by the Constitutional Court. But there have now been a succession of issues where people have queried the nature of the use of the presidential powers. There's been a standoff between presidential powers and National Assembly powers. There's been a standoff between, I guess, popular mandate and political representation within the National Assembly. And there are questions being asked about whether the constitutional system established in France as part of the Fifth Republic really is satisfactory anymore. The Fifth Republic refers to the political system that was established in France in 1958, where there is this dual executive sort of role of a president who chooses the prime minister being accountable to a National Assembly, like, say, a prime minister in a British or Australian parliament. And but unlike a British or Australian parliament, the president has real executive authority as well, and in fact chooses the president, chooses the prime minister. It's like, the governor general in Australia, but with real power and being directly elected. And one of the virtues people say of the Fifth Republic system, one of the reasons it was set up in the way it did was it was to overcome a problem of chronic changeover in governments and inability to form majority governments within France. And that system now seems to be breaking down. And indeed, there are a number of people within the French political system who are calling quite explicitly for a new French Republic, a new constitutional system, the establishment of a sixth republic. France Insoumise does this. It calls for Macron to be removed from office and for a new political system to be established. And I believe so Francois Bayrou also is actually an advocate of such a change, and he is not alone, and it is increasingly being debated. But I can't really see how, in such a deadlocked situation at the moment, it is likely that there's going to be a breakthrough. But it may well be that the 2027 presidential election may be the occasion for such a breakthrough. We shall see. That is one to watch. I think this will be perhaps one of the bigger issues to watch in the ongoing developments in France. Just how much the actual constitutional system in France is strained, and whether there's going to be a constructive collaboration or cooperative coalition formed to argue for constitutional change that might be able to fix some of the electoral problems, that might be able to fix some of the problems of the working of the National Assembly and the relationship between the presidential powers and the other executive powers within France. But I suspect all of this will mean that Emmanuel Macron will limp on until the end of his term, but we shall see. Now, people might wonder how much the war in Ukraine is a factor in all of this too. There are certainly some protests in France about this. There are calls for increased defence spending by Emmanuel Macron, and they will be supported by his new choice of Prime Minister. Sébastien Lecornu, who was previously the defence minister and is very much seen as a loyalist. However, I also wonder whether that also means that there will be some sort of bargain struck between Macron and the left, where the left gets a little bit more of its social program implemented, with Macron pretty much being in charge of defence, EU and foreign policy. But that is speculation on my part. So very interesting set of developments in France, and I think that I will come back to them further on in later discussions. And I can see someone here saying big protests coming in Brazil today. So that's interesting as well. Now, I'm sorry I haven't been responding to the many great comments here in the show, but I will perhaps come back to that in a second. There was one other main theme I wanted to hit in this live stream, and that was something I discovered actually while researching the issue of the French elections. Now, many people will have heard of Thomas Piketty, the French economist and historian, who, of course, wrote a book a little while ago about capital and wealth inequality that suddenly became a bestseller. You can still watch movies and TV shows that sort of show, show people reading Thomas Piketty's Capital to sort of establish their character and their radical nature within sort of a film. It was very much a phenomenon, I don't know, 10 or even maybe 15 years ago. And it's a pretty complicated book. And Piketty has done, some pretty deep research on quantitative dimensions of economic and social history in France, and more particularly in France. And what I discovered is that, and let me just, sorry, wrong one. Let me just bring this up for you. There you go. Thomas Piketty has a new book coming out called A History of Political Conflict, which he has co-authored with Julia Cagé. Thomas Piketty and Julia Cagé, you can see there, it is only in hardcover at this point. It's only coming out in late November 2025. And is pretty expensive right now. It is a hardcover book. It's, how long is it? It's, it's nearly 900 pages in a hardcover. So there you go. But $123 does seem to be quite a lot. But I suspect it will, the pricing might change closer to the event. And this book is a pioneering history of voting and inequality, drawing on an unprecedented data set covering more than 2 centuries of sociological findings. And it looks at all the data in France, which of course has gone through a whole series of political experiments. This is currently the 5th French Republic. The first French Republic was, post 1789. The Second French Republic was 1848 or so, for a few years, leading into the Second French Empire under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Third French Republic was the longest one so far. Between sort of 1870 and, the occupation by Germany in 1940. The fourth French Republic was 45, 46 through to 58. And we're currently in the 5th French Republic from 1958 up till today, which is, I guess, what's that? That's nearly 70 years, which is getting up roughly to the period of the Third French Republic. So perhaps it's timely for France to move to a Sixth French Republic. But this is a really fascinating book, which is looking at what, you can just see here, the tripartite division of French political life, a competition among a bourgeois central bloc and distinct factions of the urban and rural classes, has a precise and revealing historical analogue. And they show that this tripartition has always been stable, whereas the binary political conflict, which occurred a lot during the earlier years of the Fifth Republic and during the some periods of the the Third Republic, the binary conflict enabled relative equality, typical of most of the 20th century. Piketty's work more broadly really sort of actually looked at these issues. There you can see the sort of back cover of the book, and you can, I think, through the publisher, actually get excerpts from the book now. So if you're really interested in this, I do recommend actually checking this out. It's A History of Political Conflict, Elections and Social Inequalities in France by Julia Cagé and Thomas Piketty. And I'll just read to you the little blurb here from Le Monde, a bold undertaking that will undoubtedly fuel political and social debate. A key concept highlighted as a determinant of voting is geo-social class, defined as a cross-referencing of socio-economic data and location within the territory. Through the systematic use of this approach, Cagé and Piketty reach conclusions that contradict current political discourse. They make clear, in particular, that variables linked to geo-social class are far more important than those related to religion and foreign origin. So there you go. I think this is a very timely book. I do hope it comes out in a reasonably affordable edition at some point, but you can read the introduction and conclusions, the main arguments, if you like, without having to bury through all the detailed data by the publisher there. And I think it's incredibly timely because essentially what he is arguing is that in the sort of tripartite impasse that French politics, and in many ways, many countries' politics, in a way, Australia has this issue at the moment. The Australian electorate is basically divided in three between, the Labor Party, the Conservative, Liberal, National parties, and the independent sort of minor parties as well. And within the minor parties, they themselves are, if you like, divided within three between the sort of Greens, the sort of business-oriented progressives, and the sort of right-wing patriotic sort of nationalist progressives as well. Right-wing nationalist sort of patriotic Marine Le Pen, Pauline Hanson types. So this tripartite division creates real deadlocks and does not enable the same kind of effective social solutions that were a feature of much 20th century politics, the great era of democracy and reduced inequality was, in fact, really the sort of post 1918 to, I don't know, late 1960s sort of period. So there you go. That's the main sort of stuff I really wanted to talk about today. Now, let me just perhaps go back over some of the comments. I might sort of work backwards from people saying, see some comments about deleted YouTube comments. I'm never, I delete any comments that are abusive or say, so-and-so is a propagandist. But if as long as you don't do that, I don't delete it. I'm not really in control of what YouTube deletes or whatnot, and I don't quite know how that operates. I apologise to anyone if I've not kept up entirely with comments in recent times. Some of my videos have got a lot more comments than I can quite cope with in terms of my current, workload. But I do hope to, return to comments regularly. Nidesh Kumar says, we have 38 major political parties. Why it's a problem for West to have free parties? Yes, agree. I think what he argues there is, in a way, it's not necessarily the number as so much as the blocks. And I think Piketty's argument is that the tripartite system means that, his argument, and it's sort of inspired, I guess, in part by sort of Marxist analysis, as you might imagine. He wrote a book called Capital, like Das Capital. But he basically is saying that the progressive forces of the working class, if you like, are unable to advance their social interests and reduce inequality if they are divided into two political blocks between a kind of patriotic nationalist one based on various geosocial type issues, and a progressive one, and as a result, if you have that sort of three-cornered contest, there's always going to be a spoiler at the party. You always have a situation like in France at the moment where Macron can play kingmaker between divided groups. So I think that is the case, and yeah, you can have many political parties, and it's often I think I'm not entirely sold on Piketty's argument. I think it will be really interesting to see how he documents it. But I do think one of the issues is the need to develop a bit of a culture of coalition building and working together and finding ways to have practical solutions. By the various accounts I have read, that is really not an issue currently in France. They're like Australia, very much in a system of like a two-party system, and like they're working as a two-party system where there's two natural parties of government, but in fact a much more fragmented political representation, fragmented society. And I think in a way some of the solution is actually to build a bit of a political culture of coalition building and compromise and that sort of thing. I see here Biosavat says, maybe on a lighter note, you can someday do a bookshelf tour. Loved your history book recommendations. Sure, I'll do that one time. Maybe I'll even do that as a live sort of stream. Maybe, because there's a hell of a lot of them there. Maybe I'll sort of do a shelf at a time kind of thing, a little sort of intro for, I love that idea. So thanks very much, Biosavat. Let me just skim back over some, if I can find some questions. Lots of comments from people, which is great. I'll just see if there's any specific questions that I can address in the time that I've got available. This is interesting about the protests in Brazil today. So yeah, interesting. I don't know how that one's going to work out. I will check it out. Something to do with what's this one here from? There is a president bribed the Roman Senate to overlook his corruption abuses that were. There we go. That's a really interesting historical precedent. references to, Macron's, family and, banker background. I think. Here we go. Emilien D. Hello from France here. It is 5:42 a.m. The big day is about to begin. That is fantastic. And thanks for sharing that, Emilien. I will be really interested to see the news later today as to how things develop and whether what it leads to. I'm not convinced it's going to be more than a day of protest because, but we shall see. It'll be really interesting to see how things are going to develop. But ultimately, somehow or other, those political sentiments need to be translated into governing action as well. People's dissatisfaction needs to be sort of harnessed in a way that can actually lead to some sort of changes in what they want to see happen. Hang on, we've got a comment here about Rick Ozzie saying all the NGOs that are driving the protests in Nepal are US government funded. US is one of the major instigators of the Colour Revolution. Even the US-funded CPJ got involved. And look, this may well be true, but and this is what I mean, that I think things are going to happen, and people will try to manipulate those events in ways that suit them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is the only explanation of things. I don't think it is enough to just say, yes, there's a US government-funded NGO and it's present in this situation and therefore we have the complete explanation of what's going on. I actually kind of think that isn't really quite a sufficient explanation. But, that's my view, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Kiang El Heng says US interference mindset, not saying that there are no 100% outside factors, but it was definitely overplayed. Most egregious was by Brian Boletic. Let me know if you would be interested to know more. Yeah, I would be interested to know more, Kiang Heng. I wonder if there's here we are. You've got a comment here saying, hey, Jeff, the current situation in Nepal reminds me of the situation in Cambodia and Thailand a while back. I see the same patterns where the agencies of the two countries are downplayed. Yeah, I agree. I do feel the agents of these countries are downplayed. If you want to, shoot me an email, Kiang, please do. I'd be really interested in your thoughts, and we can maybe discuss it sometime. And yeah, I think that was the case in Cambodia and Thailand. I think it is the case in Nepal. I think it has been the case in the interpretation of India's actions in geopolitics as well. There's this tendency to sort of just see everything through a sort of bifurcated lens of US versus its enemies, and I think that is just not how things really operate. Even if you look at critical historical events like how World War One began and all that sort of stuff, yes, there are some big, powerful imperial interests involved, but it's surprising also how much agency is also exercised by local players, local agents, divided executives within countries as well. That's a really interesting comment from Kiang. And I do want to emphasize that I really respect a lot of what Brian does do, but I do feel there is a little bit of overemphasis of some issues. JK says, love your channel, was sick of UK MSS propaganda, enjoyed interviews by Glenn Deason and Pascal Lataz. but you give a more balanced view, which allows me to use my own intelligence. Thanks, Jay. I really appreciate that. I really love it. And I hope you do check out also the interviews I'm doing with Michael Carley as well, looking at the, I've got another interview with Michael Carley, who I interviewed about his book Stalin's Gamble and the sort of international politics, the origins of World War II, which I've got another one coming out on Friday, which I think would be really wonderful as well. Kiang Heng says Nepal is wedged right between India and China. Hard to believe it is 100% natural. And I've certainly seen some of the Indian commentary referring to influences of China and whatnot involved in the situation. And then I see also David Kay saying, yes, this is, hang on, let me show it. There we go. This is indeed a Thor's Hammer pendant, which I bought in Sweden, no less. I do really love it. And what have we got here? Real protests or foreign regime change. I think there is likely to be some quantum of local discontent that is then magnified and fanned into violence by foreign powers for their own agendas, indeed. And of course, the other thing is, it might be that, the foreign powers wanted some level of protest, but also the violence escaped their control as well. This is also quite likely a factor, that they may have felt that they could control events, but in fact, they weren't able to control events as well. I do feel there is a tendency to over-magnify this. Chris says, I'm skeptical of claims that the Nepali and Indonesia protests are orchestrated by the USA. As a Hong Konger, I saw how both superpowers represented the protests here. Very true. Tomioka Pratap Singh says, student protest in Bangladesh, an 85-year-old guy comes to power, and now in Nepal again, a young student protest. Let's see which old monk now comes to power. Yes, referring, of course, to Muhammad Yunus, of course, in Bangladesh. That's a good point. We'll see what happens. I believe the military has stepped in to restore law and order at this point. And of course, the situation in Bangladesh hasn't really quite developed as people perhaps wanted it to as well. I feel I might just quickly skip to the end, folks. Here we go. We've got a here we go. I've got a question here. Is it true that Australian opposition is breaking apart due to infighting? Well, I don't know. I mean, there's always infighting in political parties, and it's worse in a way in opposition because there's not the discipline and the patronage of government to sort of smooth the internal tensions. So it's almost always the case that oppositions are infighting, whether it's substantial. But I do think, in a way, the right side of politics in Australia is going through a bit of a transition, which the sort of left side of politics went through 20 or 30 years ago with the growth of the Greens, the soft left and the hard left just sort of splitting off a little bit and finding it hard to, the soft right and the hard right is sort of splitting off a little bit and finding it hard to sort of get, stay together. So I think there will be a lot of that infighting for some time. It will probably mean that the theatrics of politics will continue to favour the incumbent party. But if you look at the actual electoral results, it was virtually a very low change scenario in terms of actual votes for the Labor Party or votes for the Conservative parties. Bit of movement in the independents as well, but the actual there's this sort of slowly boiling disconnect between the way in which the society is expressing its sort of, political social preferences and the way in which they're represented in Parliament. And to some degree, that's part of the problem in France. It's perhaps been more clearly escalated in France, and in France it's been complicated by the fact that the party system effectively broke down like 10 to 20 years ago and has been sort of reconstituted with partly around personalities and partly around sort of new sort of social movements. And a question from Nidesh Kumar: do you think it's even good to develop political parties on just a single agenda like green energy or LGBTQ or foreign wars? How can common people connect with them, the one who do work? Well, yeah, I think that's been a challenge. It's certainly that's the thing that the major political parties tend to emphasize as a distinguishing point for them, that they've got a broad agenda. They're not single issue parties. I think the Greens in Australia and some of the other, I guess, smaller fragmented parties probably see themselves as not really single issue parties, but the reality is they don't really get much of an opportunity to have much say on anything. Although in Australia, of course, the key role of the independents and the Greens in the Senate means that every issue effectively gets negotiated with these small parties. So the broad agenda of the Greens, I think, is actually pretty well established. In many ways, I think it's a bit like that tripartite issue in that Thomas Piketty's talking about. I think the forces on the sort of Labor Green side would have had a much easier time of it over the last 30 years or so if the Greens and the Labor Party had found a way to work together rather than fight each other like, cats and dogs, which is what they've actually done. Yeah, absolutely. Brian Beletic supports his point of view with US government published references. He does, but I think, as I discussed with Tariq Shiro Amar in one of my interviews, there's plans in think tanks and statements in policy papers, but that's often actually not the actual concerted action of governments as well. It often hides much more significant disagreements and more complicated issues. Has Jeff ever researched Co-Intel Pro? I haven't. I'll make a note of it. I'll just write it down now. Co-Intel Pro. And I will look into that. House Drummer says the only way society will change is disclosure by these so-called intelligence agencies. Yeah, true. I've got this theory that, in a way, there needs to be a United Nations convention that really significantly winds back the operations of particularly the American intelligence agencies, because let's face it, they're the source of many of the problems around the world and the regime change operations. And regime change operations are, in fact, against the United Nations Charter. I really feel there should be some sort of, international intervention to restrict these things. I think it's out of the hands now of the United States. They simply have demonstrated over and over and again that they just can't be trusted anymore. But whether that is really going to be implemented, I don't know. And John B says the Ost Libs have been out neoconned by Albanese and co. Yeah, indeed. Well, I guess it's the it's the big turn, I guess, in politics. I mean, really, the Labor Party stopped being a social democratic party, I think, in the 1980s. And Sagufta Arani, and I might make this the final one, has said that the revolution in Bangladesh is a regime change by America. Dr. Yunus is closely connected with the Clinton organization and the West in general. What are your views on that? Look, I think there were significant reports about this at the time, and I've seen significant commentary about this also in the Indian media as well, and I think maybe even by some Indian government officials as well. So I do think that there is some substance to this question, some sort of intervention as well. So I have some sympathy for that. Of course, I just simply don't have, enough information to really say it with certainty. And just because it happened in Bangladesh, of course, doesn't mean that all of these dimensions in Nepal are not there. I'm sure Indian, Chinese, and American intelligence agencies are all probably active in Nepal. It's in their interest to be active in Nepal. There's certainly been some Indian commentators who say that the social media ban introduced by the Nepalese government was instigated by China as well as the US. So, there's charges and counter-charges, but there's also clearly some pretty sort of profound social issues there in Nepal. And I just hope that, the violence sort of gets curtailed and that things work out a little bit better there for the people of Nepal, because they're in a pretty bad situation. So thanks for everyone who joined me today on the live stream. Do give it a like as you're heading out. I've really enjoyed your company. I hope it's been helpful and informative to you. And some of the references to Thomas Piketty's work and some of those other articles help you, make up your own mind about what's going on. I'm not 100% sure what's going on myself. Some of the things I think one needs to do is just be open to different interpretations of how things will pan out, because not all situations are carbon copies of each other. Thanks everyone for joining me. Do head over to jeffrich.substack.com and join me there. You can also support my work by becoming a paid subscriber there. And I will see you in my next stream next week, potentially even with a guest next week. Okay, ciao.